All right, members, the chair will call the Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform to order, and there is a quorum. Today we've got three bills that are my bills, and so I'm going to be relinquishing the gavel to Chair Considine in a second in order to come forward to the testifiers table, but I understand there's a motion on the minutes somewhere on this side of the, and I'll be entertaining that with trepidation, members. So, Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, I move the minutes.
Excuse me, Lee Johnson moves the minutes of March 21st. Any discussion? If not, then all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion prevails, and the minutes of March 21st are adopted. And with that, Chair Considine, I put myself at your mercy.
And this is a Ways and Means. Okay. Out of order, Johnson. Keep practicing.
Let's take care of at least one of them
All over.
this morning.
Chair Mariani, are you ready?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would move House File 1834 be referred to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Okay. Proceed.
Mr. Chair and members, I have Director Nate Gove from the Post Board here to explain what we're doing with this simple but very important bill. There's, as you all know, there's a deficiency in this fiscal year of upwards of $500,000. And our desire is to move as expeditiously as possible on this. We will be carrying this in our target. So this will, quote unquote, count against us. But the point is that we don't want to wait until the end of session to deal with this. And the director can explain the urgency here. My understanding, Mr. Chair, members, is that the other body also feels the same way. And so the idea here is to then make an appropriation to cover the deficiency in the Post Board. And we'll talk a little bit more later. Well, perhaps even the director might say a little bit about, you know, the nature of the deficiency. But Mr. Chair, at this point, I would ask Mr. Gove to explain.
Mr. Grove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Nate Gove of the Minnesota Post Board. I'm the executive director, and I want to thank Chair Mariani for carrying this important bill for us. This is a current fiscal year funding deficiency that is a result of the revenues of the special revenue account are not meeting our current appropriation. And where this really hits the Post Board and why I'm obviously testifying in favor of it is because I need to keep the lights on and the doors open in operating our role as a regulatory agency. And I'm not able to pull from other sources. And sooner than later, MMB will certainly want to know, so what's your spending reduction plan? And frankly, that'd be very difficult to come up with since our entire operating budget is about $1.2 million per fiscal year. So this would be approaching half of that. Obviously, the Post Board plays an important role. There's many bills that talk about the Post Board, but first and foremost, from my standpoint, is we need to be able to carry out the current duties that we have that are so vital to the professionalism and our law enforcement profession in the state.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Chair Mariani, would you want to move your amendment at this point?
Mr. Chair, yes, I'd like to move the 0268 amendment. When this bill was first drafted, it put together both the deficiency in the Post Board and essentially a deficiency in the disaster assistance contingency fund account. Those items have been separated. In fact, we'll be dealing later on the floor with that, with the disaster assistance account. And so my amendment would just strip out that portion and make this just purely a deficiency funding bill for the post board for upwards of $500,000. So with that, I would move my amendment, Mr. Chair.
I can't imagine why, but any discussion on the amendment? Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign.
No.
Thank you, Representative Mueller. Chair Mariani, if you would proceed, please.
Thank you. That was a close call. I don't know how you did that, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I appreciate your support. Let's take care of this issue as quickly as possible so that this important function in state government can continue functioning.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Considine, Chair Mariani, I want to thank you for bringing this forward. It's very important. The post board does fantastic work, keeping track of the licensing of the peace officers in the state of Minnesota, making sure that they're very, very highly trained and very qualified individuals that enforce the laws of the state and protect and serve the citizens of this wonderful state. There's a number of reasons why revenue is dropping. I'm not going to get into them at this time, but it's important that we have the post board there, making sure that they keep track of the licensing. And also another important factor that they do is they come up with the curriculum in our colleges and pass that curriculum and make sure it's the proper training for our officers that we have. We have probably the highest trained officers in this country. In fact, back when I was in school, and it continues to this day, we have departments from all over the country coming to our colleges and our technical colleges and our universities recruiting the individuals taking the criminal justice course to take them out of this state to work for their departments in other states. That is how highly trained our officers are in the state.
Okay, any other further discussion? Is there anybody from the public that would like to comment? Not seeing anyone. Chair Mariani, would you like to renew your motion?
Mr. Chair, I renew my motion that House File 1834 as amended be referred to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Any last words?
There's plenty of room for co-authors in the bill, so I encourage members from both sides to join on.
We'd be happy to. Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay, passes. And at this point, our vice chair has arrived, and I'm going to turn over the gavel to her.
I was batting 1,000. I don't know now, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right, Chair Mariani, House File 2710 is going to be laid over for possible inclusion.
Madam Chair, that is my motion.
So, all right, all those in favor say aye. Oh, no. So moved. So moved.
It just simply brings the bill before us.
Oh, okay, very good. And then do I do the vote? No, okay.
Madam Chair, House File 2710 modifies the funding for the post board. We'll have Mr. Gove come up and walk through, what the current funding mechanism and history is of that, as well as to talk about the trends and what they've been facing. I don't believe Mr. Gove is here to officially be in support of the bill. However, I think he'll provide some very valuable, useful information for us. And so basically what we're doing with this is moving the post board directly into being funded from the general fund. And members, as you just saw, we did an appropriation out of the general fund to deal with a deficiency in the post board. My understanding is that's not the first time that's happened, and that there are projections that we may need to be doing that in increasingly larger numbers into the future. And so really totally this is a totally nonpartisan conversation. I've had the conversations with our lead about this issue. Not saying he's supportive of it, but I'm saying that we're acknowledging that there are issues that we need to address relative to the stability of funding the post board. And so the approach of this bill is to basically move it directly into a general fund appropriation. But Mr. Gove can explain the current funding mechanism, and then we can just sort of wrestle with that information.
Very good.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And members, Nate Gove of the Minnesota Post Board. So the Post Board is funded on a currently traffic and criminal surcharge. Upwards of the surcharge is around $77. The board is funded on 39% of the original $25 surcharge. So currently about $9.75 per surcharge transaction. Over time, this has the entire account generates around $30 million. The vast majority, 60%, returns to the general fund, is credited back to the general fund. The board only receives what were appropriated. It has been in decline. The Post Board's budget has been relatively stable for many, many years. But as of 2018, the revenues, based on the 39% formula, did not meet our appropriation, hence the current fiscal year funding deficiency request by the board. And again, thank you, Chair Mariani, for carrying that. The board supports as I walk the tightrope, the board supports changing the percentage of the original $25 that is in the governor's budget. But it is true, the special revenue count has been declining for a variety of factors over the years. And it has been a funding source for the Post Board since really the late 80s in one fashion or another. It's traffic convictions. It's been amended many times over the years.
Thank you, Director Go. I have an amendment, a DE1 amendment. Would someone like to offer this? Representative Johnson.
Chair, Representative Mariani, members, I have the DE1 amendment, which is governor's recommendation to keep the money for mandated officer training in a separate dedicated fund, and that is not subject to the whims of the general fund appropriations. I believe it's important to keep this separate. We've had times where there's been budget shortfalls. And this type of fund and this training is very important. I believe it does need to stay in a special revenue fund. This changes the numbers from 39% to 62% for the Post Board, with 37% going to the general fund. And I believe it's 1% goes to the DNR for their training. And that percentage is, members remember, is only on the first $25 of the surcharge. That was done intentionally years ago when this was set up to make sure that the Post Board got the proper funding they needed. And that number's been changed, adjusted a little bit here and there. But yeah, and I believe back in the 80s, when I was an officer writing tickets, the entire surcharge is $25. That has gone up dramatically over the years to the point where officers quit writing tickets because it was getting too expensive. In fact, a $25 maximum fine for a seatbelt ticket, once you put all the surcharges in, is $135. So we are way over the amount of surcharges we add. But like I said, it's important to make sure that funding for Post Board is steady and is there all the time. That's why I bring this amendment forward, and it is the governor's recommendation.
Chair Mariani.
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, in keeping with my contrarian reputation, I get to argue against the governor's proposal. Lee Johnson and I have had a bit of a conversation about this, and so I absolutely, received the amendment, in the spirit of trying to do the right thing. I think that we agree with that. So there's no, game playing going on here. This is really a matter of choice in terms of where we feel the most comfortable in terms of providing stability for the post board. If we don't wind up doing the special revenue fund adjustment, or if we wind up don't doing that, we should all know that right now the projected shortfalls, that there are projected deficiencies coming forward to the tune of over 800,000 in FY20, over 900,000 in FY21, and over 1 million in FY22. We've heard a couple of bills this year that attempts to address what many of us feel is a heavy burden that's creating unintended consequences relative to the size of the traffic citations that feed the special revenue fund. And I suspect that pressure will continue to build. I think it's part of all of us, or many of us, responding to a call for adjusting those fees and fines to be much more fair. And we're concerned with the disparate impact that it's having in our society. All that by way of saying that the kind of pressures, arguably, I can't quantify it, regardless of whether we do the governor's percentage or we stay at the same, the pressure is going to continue to build on the special revenue fund. And the cleanest way, it seems to me, for us to deal with this issue is just to be very transparent and upfront about our commitment of funding the post board through the general fund. The special revenue fund feeds the general fund. We can have our fiscal agent or our fiscal staff walk through a little bit about the relationship between the special revenue fund and the general fund, and how we actually move those dollars through. Eventually, it's all general fund impact. And I get the uncertainty argument, Representative Johnson. I don't want to make that small. I would argue that there's an uncertainty element happening right now. And so I think that this, in the end, really comes down to legislators continuing to make the strong tradition, the traditional strong commitment to funding the things that we have said are important. We've said the post board is important. We've said the training components are important. Later on, we're going to talk about parts of that training component where I'm looking to actually elevate just how important that work is for us. And it's just like anything else we do here in the legislature. We prioritize, and we generally, I think, get it right in terms of funding what needs to be funded. And so I'm confident that if we do this move, we'll continue to have that strong commitment to the post board and to the training components that we expected to provide for our peace officer, law enforcement community. So I respectfully would urge you your no vote on the DE1 amendment.
Thank you, Chair Mariani. Representative Long, you have a question to the DE1 amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple questions for Director Gove. So under the current surcharge special revenue approach, are deficits likely in the future for the post board?
Under the current formula, yes.
And Madam Chair, Director Gove, even if we raise the special revenue fund charges, do you anticipate that this may not cover your costs at some point in the future?
Madam Chair, Representative Long, yes, potentially beyond fiscal year 2023, but I don't have data on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Members, is any more discussion to the DE1 amendment? Representative Johnson.
Chair, members, with this amendment, that would bring in just in 2020, just shy of 1.9 million into the fund. In 2021, over $2 million. This would be more than enough to cover the deficits for a number of years. Till we can look at some other issues dealing with the surcharges and figuring out what to do. It give us opportunity to really look into how the best way to keep the post board separate from the appropriations so they don't get bogged down in the bureaucracy that we have down here.
Representative Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I know I had to step out briefly. But as I look at this and what I just heard, it seems that the amendment actually, like in the future, puts it in a deficit, which is, I think, what the intent of your original bill is to not do that, to take that relief off of, the fee portion that funds the post board and actually put it into a line item in the general operations. So I'm really concerned that the DE amendment would actually put it in a deficit off in the future.
Chair Mariani, any feedback to that? No? Okay. All right, well, very well, members, we will take a vote on the DE1 amendment then. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign?
No.
The motion does not prevail. Members, do you have any questions to the bill? Chair Mariani, last words on the bill?
Madam Chair, unless there's anyone else in the audience that wishes to testify, I would urge members to be supportive of this. We will obviously be returning to this issue as we mark up our omnibus bill, and it could well be we'll see amendments at that point as well. That's certainly how we do things here. But I look forward to the ongoing problem solving together on this issue.
Very well. Thank you, Chair Mariani. Your House File 2710 will be laid over for possible inclusion. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Chair Mariani, House File 2709, we do not have in our possession, so we'll be just having an informational hearing on that today.
Madam Chair, our intent is to have 2709 before us, but obviously things don't move as quickly as we thought.
Very good.
They would under the new regime here, if you will. Madam Chair, we had a bit of a conversation this morning on House File 2709, particularly on the data privacy provisions. The bill, of course, really heavily hinges on data collection and data reporting. So that was appropriate, but it's absolutely appropriate to have that conversation here. The bill was amended in judiciary, and so my comments are really to the E6 amendment, which you all should have before you. Let me just say that the bill is before you largely because I think we have an important ability and opportunity to continue to push in our state for increasing the professional standards and behaviors of our peace officer, law enforcement community. I think Lee Johnson was correct in calling out what historically has been unfolding in our state. And so I really want to offer this bill within that spirit of that movement in Minnesota, of expecting high standards of behavior from our law enforcement communities, of making state investments to ensure as best as we can that be the outcomes. a few years ago, in a bipartisan manner, and in fact, when the minority, the present minority were in the majority, Chair Cornish, who chaired our predecessor committee at that time, was part of an important conversation relative to the training of our peace officers in our state as we were responding to some tragic circumstances. One, of course, involving my community, although it physically took place outside of St. Paul with Philando Castile tragedy. And as a result of that, and I'll stand to be corrected by members who served on that committee who are still here, who have better inside knowledge on that. But as a result of that, this committee and the legislatures lifted up and prioritized the need for implicit bias training, for training in policing mental health issues and incidences where mental health is part of the dynamic, and in training for de-escalation practices and skills. House File 2709, and so as part of that, what we did was we frankly put a lot more money on the table to be able to provide, to add to the overall training regime with that strong expectation that those three areas are added to the cyclical training that's mandated and required of our police officers as part of their licensing. And so House File 2709 does a couple of things. One of the things it does is that it continues that training. One of the things that happened as a result of the negotiations with the other body relative to this direction was a acceptance of putting $12 million more in the biennium for training, but resulting in a sunset, which is set to happen in the end of the next biennium. And so one of the things that this bill does is it extends the sunset out yet another year. Frankly, members, I would like to get us to a point where we're not dealing with sunsets, but I'm willing to take this one step at a time. House File 2709 has data collection and reporting provisions that are related to that move on the part of the legislature. And the bill then seeks to establish a way to measure the effectiveness, I would argue, the effectiveness of that training. Some of you are in the private sector, some of you in nonprofit, government sector, and you know that in the last generation, increasingly, the thinking in all those sectors is that we ought to be measuring outcomes of our investments. And I think that's one of the issues that frankly is missing from the work that we do in our state as we invest in skill, professional development of our peace officer community. That's not a slam on them. That's just an observation on us in terms of what we do when we use the people's resources with the expectation that there be better and solid, strong outcomes. And my big question is, well, how do you know that if you're not collecting data and you're not creating opportunities to reflect on that data, to have that inform your decision-making, have that further inform, in this case, the elements of training for our peace officer community. So this bill then seeks to establish a way to measure that effectiveness by the collection of data that's sent to the Pulse Board. And by the way, it also makes it contingent. I mean, there's a a period of time here, but also makes it contingent for CLEOs to have access to that training dollar to participate in this data collection and reporting system. And the data universe here is really in 4 areas. It's with traffic citations. What we're looking for is data on ethnicity. We had a conversation earlier today about that. I suspect we'll have it again, and I welcome that. It's on peace officer discipline findings. Being real clear that we're interested only in those major issues, not minor, mistakes or things that human beings do that, can produce, a discipline action. We're really interested in major discipline issues or major discipline issues that are connected to, reports of misconduct, of excessive force, involving the integrity and truthfulness of an officer, violations of law, and of sexual misconduct or harassment. There's also a third bucket, if you will, of data that involves use of force data. This is tied to the BCA's already requirement of that kind of reporting from our locals. And then finally, to NIBRS reporting. And NIBRS reporting, so I've been learning a lot, members. NIBRS reporting is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. It's basically going to retire the summary reporting system, the SRS, which my understanding has been part of our uniform crime reporting regime for decades in our nation. And NIBRS, the national, basically the FBI's UCR program is making NIBRS the only nationwide format for crime statistics in the United States. That regime, that data collection reporting framework, intends to go far deeper than what we've been doing for generations, particularly in providing circumstance and context for crimes, things like location, time of day, where the incident occurred. The expectation is that NIBRS is going to provide more useful statistics to promote good decision-making on the part of law enforcement, as well, frankly, as good constructive decision-making for policymakers like us. So anyway, that's the fourth bucket of data reporting. The other data elements related to this, and also policy consideration, is that the bill appropriates funds to contract through the Office of through OJP, Office of Justice Programs, to a community research organization. We're particularly interested, quite frankly, in the Wilder Foundation, that has done some work in this area and has extensive experience in working with state programs that involve data privacy, and so are top-notch in terms of respecting and working within our expectations of data privacy. And the expectation is that this organization then will work with the Post Board to do a number of things, to develop a public summary of the data, to develop a platform on which to share that, to make sure that there's standardization of the data so that we're doing an apples-to-apples representation of the data that's going to be coming in from the hundreds of law enforcement entities, and potentially also to work with the Post Board for the sake of being able to, over time, provide good training for our law enforcement community related to potentially related to NIBRS, but more importantly, related to the kind of information that folks reflect on in terms of how that impacts decision-making at the CLEO. So there are problems. I'm not too abashed to say that there are some issues with the language in DE6 that I made a commitment in judiciary to continue to work on, to fix. Throughout this whole process of constructing this, we've been, my staff and I have been engaging with a number of entities in the law enforcement community. I'm not saying they're supportive, but I'm saying that I'm interacting with them, and it's been very constructive with the chiefs, with the sheriffs, with the MPOA, BCA, Post Board, as well as with a number of advocacy groups, particularly those who advocate on mental health issues and policing related to that, and with survivors of sexual assault who, quite frankly, for a number of years have been envisioning the creation of something like this in order to enhance law enforcement as it interacts with sexual assault and sexual assault survivors. And so my intent is to continue to work on that. The 4 areas in particular has to do with Section 1, where we're looking for ethnicity data on traffic citations. I believe we've constructed this the wrong way, because our intent is not to have ethnicity be part of the citation itself. Our only interest is really to be able to gather information from those incidents. And of course, what we're interested in is we've talked about this before in this committee around implicit bias, is to draw out the perception of the citing officer. Implicit bias training is strongly dependent on knowing what the perceptions are that the person holds as a way to then construct curriculum and training for deeper awareness of and practices for us to be able to work past our biases. As Representative Bowler shared in committee this morning, implicit bias is not something that is subject or present only with one profession. It's actually part of the human condition, and in our society is part of all our makeup, including myself. The other area we want to address is in Section 2. This has to do with reporting specific name and license or badge number of the officer involved, party to the discipline findings. The interesting thing, members, is that information is currently available as public data at the local level. There's concern about keeping it public once we move it to a state central database system. I am more than open to hearing through what those concerns are and to make adjustments accordingly. The only reason, frankly, why we have it on the table really is it goes to the thinking that the closer you can get to reality in terms of understanding who, what, when, et cetera, the better and stronger your intervention is going to be, your training is going to be, your leadership, your decision-making is going to be. However, I think there may be ways for us to create anonymity filters for that, or perhaps even move, into a more summary approach. The language in the D6 amendment really, I think, signals the author's intent. If you look at lines 3.22, 21 to 22, where we clearly state that data on the discipline section is private data, and that if there's reporting out to the public, that's done in a summary fashion. So that's signaling my intent and the spirit of what I want to be able to accomplish here relative to that. So I will continue to work on that. There's also a question about where the data sets eventually will be housed. It'd be interesting to hear from the Post Board and from the BCA as well about that, because BCA in particular has hosts crime data currently. Whether this is information that could be done and could be fitted there is a conversation we're having with them. The Post Board may well be the other place. The Post Board has challenges. I think Director Gove will share with you that they're not, in many ways, not totally into the digital world yet, if you will. So there's a lot of paper reporting and maintaining of records. It's not a bad thing, but it certainly makes it difficult to create the kind of database that we're looking for. It's possible that we could house either for a short period of time or for a long time within the research entity. That certainly does and probably should raise questions about maintaining the integrity and the privacy that's important. Here, as I mentioned earlier, the Wilder Foundation has a long history of being able to do that, but that's still not determined in this bill. It is implied in the current language that it's going to be at Post Board, but we're not being clear about that yet. It's my intent to be clear with that as I continue to engage in conversations with the entities that I mentioned. There's also some other issues, on page 4, on page 5, on line 5.5 to 5.7. NIBRS reporting, and I'm learning this stuff pretty quickly. NIBRS reporting happens in several levels. So at one level, you're going to have reporting of major, just looking quickly for the list here, major crimes, so your homicide, arson, sexual assault, et cetera. And then there's a B level, if you will, for incidents and crimes that are lower than that. It's the author's desire to be able to capture data related to that level of offenses as well. But there may be some difficult technical challenges to that at the BCA, and so I'll continue to work with them on that. So members, that's basically it. And again, the desire here is to, as I started out, to move us to a culture where we're not just making an investment and counting the inputs, as important as inputs are, so inputs would be the quality of the training, the credentials of who's training, absolutely important things. I think we should also be looking at the outcomes. That's true in every sector. In this sector, it's challenging because there's some level of subjectivity relative to the outcomes, and I want to be sensitive to that. And so I'm really looking for us working together to be able to find a good sweet spot relative to that. But I'm convinced, members, that if we're going to continue to make a strong case to the people of Minnesota that $12 million every 2 years is a really good investment, I think we need to be showing the populace that. And while I do accept Representative Johnson's depiction of our law enforcement at large, it's no secret here to anyone that there are whole communities that don't share in that don't have that level of confidence. and share that outlook. Our goal should be to help communities get to that point, because at the end, public safety is only going to be as powerful as the confidence that the public places in our peace officers. And frankly, I think our peace officers become stronger if they have that reciprocal mutual understanding relationship with the populace, with data-driven decision-making. I think we can get there. So members, that's it. I thought I was going to do this really quickly, but I guess I didn't.
Thank you, Chair, and I understand that you have 4 testifiers. And members, I know there's questions, but I'm going to take the testifiers
Yeah,
first,
that's good.
and then we can go to member questions.
I'll ask them to be briefer than I was.
Very good. A Wilder Foundation I have, I don't know who's here from there. Wilder, NAMI, BC, or MCBW, Council of Minnesota African Heritage. If you could all come up to the front, and then we'll go in that order.
Madam Chair,
Yeah. Representative Grossel.
it's Bemidji Day. I've got the Bemidji Chamber I've got to go talk to at about 1400. So if there's any way to be able to ask a couple questions before them.
I will defer to the chair.
Madam Chair, I think it's important to get the testimony in, but I'm certainly willing to engage in a quick conversation, and then we can pick it up from there.
And Representative Grossel, I'm happy you told me what those the vests are for, because I was complimenting everybody on the way over on the vest, and so I actually want one. So
I'll be growing out of this one soon. I'll pass it down.
Representative Grossel, did you have a quick word to say?
Yes, Madam Chair, just a couple things as far as, and I mentioned these before, Mr. Chair, at the Judiciary Committee, as far as the training and et cetera. I know we have a lot of things geared towards dealing with training law enforcement. Let's make our law enforcement officers better. And that's always good. That's always what I strive for. That's always what the sheriff's offices and the police departments in our communities strive for. My thoughts, and we've had these discussions offline as well, that what is the public doing towards meeting the sheriff's deputies and the police officers, meeting them halfway with making improvements as far as how the community is approaching our law enforcement officers as well. Are there steps being taken in some of these communities that you mentioned, or that you know of? Are there attempts to say, our officers are looking inside of themselves? Are we looking inside of ourselves as community members?
Madam Chair, and
Chair
actually
Mariani.
this might be also a good way to bring in at least the first 2 testifiers on this. But let me just say that I think that's perfect. And I think that when I talked about data-driven decision-making, I think that's what that sets up. And so I think the outward-looking component of this then arms, equips both community and law enforcement with ways to be able to talk with each other in a consistent way, and data around which to do that beyond just how I feel today. So I fully embrace, I think, where you're going with this, which is I really need a whole community dynamic here, and this is really about creating a tool around which we can do that. But perhaps.
And Representative Grossel, I'm gonna take the 2 testifiers first, and then maybe come back to you if we can do that. The representative from Wilder, if you would like to state your name and begin your testimony.
Yes, thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Paul Matesic, Executive Director of Wilder Research. Wilder Research is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, part of the Wilder Foundation. We study the effectiveness of programs and also social trends, focusing on Minnesota. And we appreciate that many legislators of both parties and their staff use many of the nonpartisan information resources that we provide. we welcome the opportunity to participate in this kind of an initiative and certainly endorse it because we think that it can lead to improved relationships of trust between community and police, improved understanding of the context in which law enforcement contact occurs and what drives the content of those occurrences, consensus between diverse stakeholders related to what indicators could be captured to improve the consistency and reliability and accessibility and actionability of policing data. And we see that this could lead to an increase in the access to and use of data to inform decisions about policing in Minnesota. This kind of endeavor could lead to more consistent, reliable, accessible, and actionable data in all police jurisdictions in Minnesota. It could result in an increased capacity and better tools to use these data for decision-making regarding community knowledge of police on the one hand, to build that kind of understanding, police practices understanding, and also in developing public policy, department-wide management, officer-level supervision, training, and performance improvement. It could have all those advantages. The database that Representative Mariani was discussing could have a public face to it in which aggregate summary data are presented so that we can track trends, we can look at accountability, both respect to the community and the police, so that we can actually get to the bottom of questions as to why are the police doing what they're doing, so the community better understands that. It could also include kind of a second layer in which data could be available only on a limited basis to particular departments to use for their own improvement, their own training, their own database decision-making. And this, we learned 3 years ago when we first began exploring this initiative, is something that many departments would very much welcome because it could assist them in making the kind of progress that they themselves would like to make. So in short, we think that this kind of work is work that would be very feasible. It could be done in ways that are consistent with all data privacy concerns, Data Practices Act. At Wilder Research, we process thousands, hundreds of thousands of records that are health data, mental health data, protected health information, corrections information. It's all done in a way that's secure. It's all done in a way that maintains confidentiality of individuals. Summaries are prepared so that individuals cannot be identified in those summaries. So this offers, I think, a really outstanding opportunity to improve both law enforcement and community action and bring law enforcement and community closer together around a common set of indicators.
And Madam Chair, I wonder if Ms. Abderholden, to your question, sir, but we might also add something that's currently part of your practices relative to his inquiry.
Ms. Abderholden.
Madam Chair, members, Sue Abderholden, NAMI, Minnesota. We actually do a lot of education about how our family members should be calling police. So we actually have a booklet called Crisis Planning, both one for adults and one for kids, making it very clear what to say to a 911 operator, what to do when the police come, understand that they are now in control of the situation, things like that. We also just released 2 online 15-minute videos on how to handle or deal with a children's mental health crisis, one in Spanish, to make sure that we're reaching more people. And we actually have a little bookmark that has the steps and what to say, including, are there weapons in the home and things like that, so that the 911 operators have as much information to relay to the police as possible. So we're doing what we can to make sure that family members who have a loved one with a mental illness know what to do in a mental health crisis so we have the best outcome possible.
Thank you, Mrs. Abderholden. Representative Grossell, did you want to follow up to her question?
Please.
Oh,
Thank-
sure. Go ahead,
Thank you,
Representative
Madam
Grossell.
Chair. Mr. Chair, and I'm hearing this, and, as a former law enforcement officer, we've been dated and studied to death, as far as, how can we improve? And we're fathers, we're mothers, we're brothers, we're sisters, grandparents. We come from the same homes as everybody else. We go out there every day to protect people, to help people. And there was never a day that I walked out that door expecting or ever wanting to shoot somebody. That day came, 30 days as a police officer, where a suspected drug dealer decided he wanted to kill me that morning, and he shot me. And in the struggle over his weapon, he was killed. That's a very tragic morning. It's a very ugly morning. I live with that scar for the rest of my life. So when we're looking at these things, you know, my first question to that individual is, I knew who it was. I called him by name and I asked him, what's happening this morning? It was a disgruntled customer in a hotel lobby. And his family had decided to put him at the hotel because they didn't want to deal with his issues with paranoid schizophrenia. I didn't know that. But 2 words in, just a few words into that encounter, gun came out this far from between my eyes. All I could do was react then. And, you know, the community's got to understand, and that's where, you know, like I said, you can study us all you want. We're there to help people, but the community's got to understand, in those few seconds, the snap of a finger, that we have to make a decision between life and death. We've got to do our jobs. You know, and it's like I said, I pray for that man every day. I think of him every day. Every time I move this arm, I think of him because there's still pain there. So it's, I think when we're looking at law enforcement and we're wanting to improve law enforcement all the time, but we never do anything about how we are conducting ourselves in public. You know, because I grew up, be respectful to your peace officers, and the same will come back to you. Treat each other decently. Treat others as you wish to be treated. You know, and that's how I grew up. Did I run amok every once in a while and had to be reined in by the police? Yeah, I'd get reminded, and I still do. So I want you know, I'm hoping and I trust that you will look very carefully at these things to make sure that these people that you're wanting to improve, that they're protected as well from any invasiveness that is not necessary. Our police departments and our sheriff's offices do everything to make sure that their people are squared away and doing the right things, doing their jobs. And you know, if they're anything like me, you take it very personal. With much authority comes much responsibility. So
Thank you.
please keep that in mind.
Thank you, Representative Grosso.
And I would, Madam Chair, just very quickly, I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your passion with me individually, but also with committee members and the public, and obviously your service. I think Mr. Matisic, I think, said it best here, that creating tools, more than just data, more than just gotchas, but creating tools around which folks could arrive at that understanding across sectors, community and our law enforcement, is worth our effort. And for me, anyway, makes it increasingly good in terms of making the kind of investment that we're making in the training of our police officers.
And then, thank you, Chair. Representative Dean, to keep it short so we can go to our next testifier.
Yes, I will, Madam Chair. And I think as Chair Mariani spoke, this is really about understanding. It's not about persecuting any particular group of people. I think that, you know, we give officers a lot of responsibility, a lot of authority. We have high expectations for them. And at the same way, I think there are many people out in the community that also have high expectations for the community and work with the community. You know, a few years ago, I had a testimony by a member here, and I asked him if his dad had the talk with him. And he sort of chuckled, and he brought up birds and bees. I said, no, that's not the talk I'm talking about. I'm talking about the conversation that so many Black and brown parents have with their with their children, used to be boys, but now it's girls as well, about what happens, what do you do when you encounter a police officer? Because we know that those are dangerous situations, and that we do have some issues of sometimes how we police in certain communities. And I think it's the community's responsibility along with the officer's responsibility to try to make sure that folks are as safe as possible. And I'll let the other testifiers go, and then I'll have a couple other questions and possible comments about what's actually in the DE 6 amendment.
Thank you. If I could have Justin Terrell come up from the Council of Minnesota African Heritage. I understand that you have to leave for an appointment, so if we could.
And Madam Chair, if I could have Ms. Abderholden actually finish her testimony. She was responding.
Very, very well. If you wouldn't mind letting Mr. Terrell go, because he does have an appointment, thank you so much. And then we'll go, Ms. Abderholden, back to you.
Madam Chair, thank you. Members of the committee, I apologize for being rushed and forgetting my suit jacket. As some of you may have heard, 4,000 Liberian citizens had their status extended today. And as the council who represents 425,000 Minnesotans in the entire African diaspora in the state of Minnesota, it's a busy day for us. So I will speak to, just give my short testimony on this bill. I'm a big fan of data collection in regards to policing in this, law enforcement in the state of Minnesota. If you look at what Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman recently launched with his database dashboard on the Hennepin County website, it's a good example of the kind of work that we're doing here that this bill would propose. The reality is information kills rumors, right? And in the African heritage community, the rumor, the relationship, however you want to describe it, with law enforcement in the state of Minnesota is one that has a lot of work to be done on it, right? We know that there are disparities, that African Americans are 11 times more likely to be stopped by officers. At least in Hennepin County, we know that we make up 6% of the state's population, 34% of the state's prison population. These things are not by accident. And so as lawmakers, and in my advisory role, I would advise you to pass bills such as this that allow you to do the analysis of what contributes to those disparities. And simply by having and tracking the data, we can figure out what trends are in play and figure out what we can learn from that. So I think those are my comments off the jump. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are some concerns.
Very good. Members, do you have any questions for Mr. Terrell? Very well. Thank you, Mr. Terrell, for your testimony.
Thank you for
I
your
hope you make it to your appointment. All right. Ms. Abderholden, if you would like to finish your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. Sue Abderholden, NAMI, Minnesota. We probably understand more than most the challenges that police officers face when they come upon a scene, not necessarily having all the information, and someone's having a mental health crisis. We understand those are really difficult situations. But we also know from the Star Tribune report that looked into fatal police encounters that about 45% of all of those deaths involve someone with a mental illness or someone having a mental health crisis. And that has, spurred our support for more police training. So we think it's important to have this data, to be able to look at what the trends are, find out kind of maybe where there are some, problem areas so that we can address them. The one thing that we think should be frankly added, and we talked briefly about this, and I know there's not time today, but to really look at what was the training that those police officers received, because it really is up to the individual police departments. We have, the 40-hour CIT training. We have an 8-hour that someone developed. We have another one from the Hamlin professors that developed at Minnetonka. What are the most effective ways to actually train police would also be helpful. So if we knew that there was a problem and a complaint and perhaps there was a fatal encounter, really looking at what was the training and was it effective training could also be really helpful into the future. We don't want this to be a, kind of a slamming kind of thing. We really want to learn from what happens and whether there's mistakes made or misunderstandings, whatever it might be, what those complaints are. We want to learn from those and do better. And so that is why we're supporting the bill today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abderholden. Someone from MCBW, if you could come up and state your name and begin your testimony.
Chair, members of the committee, I'm Liz Richards, the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, testifying here in support of House File 2709 to extend the law enforcement training dollars and to work to address data collection and compliance discipline issues. We've been working on issues of training and compliance with law enforcement for a number of years, much of that work actually through the post board. What training is needed, what's effective, how is it monitored, how do we measure it? Our focus has been very much on domestic and sexual violence issues, which are also contained within this bill. We are also concerned about issues of implicit bias and the issues around de-escalation and how people with mental health issues are approached. We represent 93 domestic and sexual violence programs around the state, and they're working in all 87 counties. They work very closely on a daily basis with law enforcement and are very concerned about how training and compliance is looked at around our issues. We welcome the opportunities that are put forward in this bill to continue to work with the Post Board, with the BCA, and with other law enforcement associations to further this work. The one thing that we would ask is that at least one of the community member positions that are being designated within the research work be someone who represents domestic and sexual violence victims. And so we support this bill.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. Very well. Okay, I think we'll go to, is anyone here that's from the public that would like to testify? Mr. Hutton, would you like to come up and testify? And if there's other members of law enforcement that would like to join him? Mr. Hutton, go ahead and state your name and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Hutton. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, representing the 87 elected county sheriffs in Minnesota. I'm here to testify on behalf of the Minnesota Sheriffs regarding House File 2709. First, we'd like to thank Chair Mariani for the conversation regarding this bill. There has been a very good exchange of ideas and information on the items contained within the bill, and we do appreciate the commitment of continued conversation. In our review, we identify 5 pieces of interest in the bill, 5 pieces of interest to the sheriffs. First one is NIBR's compliant requirement. The Minnesota Sheriff's Association understands law enforcement agencies' requirement to be NIBR's compliant by 2021 through the federal government. Minnesota law enforcement continue to work with their records management system vendors to make this a reality, but nothing is ever easy with IT projects. We are all aware IT projects are not typically delivered on time, without issues, or within budget. It is costly for counties to meet this requirement. Number 2 would be the use of force reporting through the BCA. This is currently ongoing. We do know that more work needs to be completed with law enforcement by way of educating on the reporting process. Third, post-annual report data reporting. More review of this is needed. We do understand that the need for a clear statewide picture. Currently, law enforcement reports summary data to Post of officer complaints on an annual basis. The reported data is not specific to an individual licensed peace officer or any specific complaint. The proposed bill requires that Post publish summary data annually. Let's agree on what data points are needed and report that information. Traffic citation, ethnicity. The MSA does not support guessing on anyone's ethnicity. Guessing does not give anyone accurate or even good data. It potentially can place the officers in a bad situation. Lastly, peace officer training assistant. The Minnesota Sheriff's Association appreciates the monies that have been appropriated to the mandated training. We continue to express our concern that the monies have a sunset date. This bill adds to those potential mandates and has only delayed the sunset date. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address this bill, and we look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you for your testimony, Officer Hutton. Sir, would you like to testify? Please state your name and begin your testimony.
Madam Chair and members, for the record, my name is Dan Hatton. I'm the police chief for the city of Hutchinson. Today, I'm representing the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association. I am its current president of the association, which represents more than 300 police chiefs in departments of all sizes in all corners of our great state. I want to thank Chair Mariani in regards to bringing this proposal forward and to engaging us in our association on the front end. Our association looks forward to working with the legislature as this proposal moves on. But we have some questions and concerns about the proposal as drafted. First, we cannot support legislature continuing to sunset the important training dollars. Our association, along with others, came forward with this training proposal 2 years ago because we believe peace officers in the state will benefit from this training in the areas of recognizing and valuing diversity, cultural differences, conflict management, mediation, and crisis intervention. To be clear, we in law enforcement ask for this training, and we collectively feel we need this training. It's important if the training continues to improve policing in the state of Minnesota. In addition to the training, we also ask for the money because this type of training is quite costly, and the majority of the cities simply don't have the means to pay for it. Most police departments in the state of Minnesota, which you well know, are fewer than 10 members. Many are 5 or less. Many of these departments have annual budgets of only a few $1,000s. If we really want to maintain a high level of professionalism that we're striving for in the police profession, we need this long-term investment. Secondly, there are some very good points in this bill that we support. The initiatives like working together, all of our agencies on the NIBRS to be NIBRS compliant. Many of our agencies are already doing that now. The more accurate data that we can collect on crime, the better that we can design strategies to keep our citizens informed and our communities safe. However, please know that there are a variety of technological challenges and costs associated with becoming NIBRS compliant. Most of those costs have been covered to this point by the state or federal grants, but it is unclear how long that money will be available. This bill also contains some significant language issues that still need more significant work. Third, while the intent to gather ethnicity data on the uniform traffic tickets is a noble one, it would only apply to the actual traffic citations and not to contacts made in the field. It puts officers in a terrible position to take an educated guess as to the individual's race or ethnicity. And I'm confident that this would lead to inaccurate data, which helps no one. And it has the potential of adding another barrier to positive community interactions and relationships with our citizens. Furthermore, this approach to data collection will be problematic in the courts. Attorneys and defendants will use the officer's educated guess to demonstrate that if this data is inaccurate, they will ask the courts to consider all of the officer's testimony to be inaccurate. Finally, we also feel the discipline data report language needs much work. The current bill sends full complaint data to the post board, and we feel that summary or aggregate data submitted to the post board would be more than appropriate. Most complaints actually come from or are generated from within the agency, and sometimes are very minor. The bill as drafted doesn't even allow for the agency to indicate that the complaint came from within its own agency, to show that our officers do in fact take discipline seriously. It simply says a complaint came from either a member of the public or other sources. And furthermore, while this data would be classified as private data, our association remains concerned about the security of that type of sensitive personal data being housed in a database run by a community-based research group, which would prevent by this could be prevented by simply reporting aggregate data directly to Post Board. So again, on behalf of our association, we want to thank the chair for our ongoing discussions on this bill, and we thank you, the committee, for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Chief Hutton, for your testimony. Members, oh, sorry. Oh. What? Okay, members, I'm going to go to questions now. Representative Considine, thank you. Oh, is he still here? There he goes.
Just leaning back, listening. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Mariani. Thank you for bringing the bill and your commitment to keep working on it. Particularly, I think the data parts still need some tweaking. As we have gone through this and listening, I had a couple of brief comments. They've gotten a lot larger. I've actually known now 4 police officers that have shot somebody and killed them in the line of duty. Counting Representative Grossel. All 4 were white, the deceased, but 3 of the 4 had some sort of mental health component. And all 4 of them have one thing in common, a great regret that this has happened. I mean, it greatly impacted all of them negatively, and I think if we can work on some more training for de-escalation and how to deal with the mentally ill, I think that's a great thing. My hope for this bill, and one other thing about Representative Grossel, talking about the community, that's the basis for community policing, is to bring the community, the police force together and make it a cooperative effort. And I think that has been the thrust of this committee for the entire session, and I hope we keep working in that direction. But lastly, to the bill, it is my hope, and I believe it is the chair's intent, that this will eventually lead to more specific and relevant training for peace officers, and that at some point it will actually lead to probably a little bit more money for that when we have stuff that we can specifically identify as needs. The other thing that I'm hoping is that somebody brought up diversity training or diversity hiring or meeting goals for diversity. We had a Pathways to Policing program that frankly wasn't very well crafted, and I am hoping that the data from this will lead to another program in which we can be more specific and achieve some of those goals, which again I think will be a boon for the police chiefs association, the sheriffs, and give them another resource. But it does pretty much all is dependent on getting the data and being able to say, this is the direction we want to go, and I think it will be helpful. Anyway, thank you, Representative Mariani. Thank you for the testifiers for coming in.
Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as we discussed in Judiciary this morning, on the line 1.12 of the DE, I have high concerns with that, but Chair Mariani did express that this was still a work in progress. So I would just want to get my concerns on the record here. And some of them have already been voiced, but I just want to reiterate. So as I read line 1.12, it's the word must exists. It's not perceived, it's must identify. So to what extent does that mean? Is that an accurate as the person self-identifies, or is it the officer's perceived, right? First question. Second question, as we discussed in judiciary, it's the word ethnicity and not race. There are many ethnicities within a single race. And so I would expect that most law enforcement officers are probably going to default to race, actually, in their identification and not ethnicity. So just something to keep in mind here. Third, as I'm thinking the other hats that I wear in the spheres of my life, a licensed real estate agent. So as a licensed real estate agent, I interact with my clients colorblind. I don't care which your race or ethnicity is. And we are trained I'm both a licensed real estate agent and a licensed general contractor. And it's made very clear in our continuing ed that we cannot make decisions or discriminate based on those demographics at all. And so in the context of law enforcement, I am very concerned about the schism that this creates. Similar to real estate agents, law enforcement agents are trained not to look at race, ethnicity, when they're dealing in their job. But now what we're doing is we're coming in and we're saying, we want you to cast that aside, and we specifically want you to try to determine ethnicity. We want you to put the lens of ethnicity on. And that's a huge concern that I have. And then lastly, we've heard the phrase data-driven decision-making. Because it's likely going to be perceived as the officer determines, not actual, it'll be perceived, that data will filter up and it'll be consolidated and it'll eventually make its way to the legislature. And then there's going to, I fully expect we're going to be attempting to make decisions or at least conclusions based on this data that filters up eventually. And the data then at that point that we're going to be having is not actual, it's perceived, it's flawed. The data is inherently flawed. It's not scientific. So how can we make data-driven decisions based on perceived rather than actual? And I have a high concern with the language as we see it and what's attempting to be accomplished here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair Mariani.
Well, Madam Chair, very quickly, and I think Chief Haddon actually spoke to some of the components, and I do share the concerns that have been expressed, particularly around Section 1 with the traffic citation. And I've already confessed that has been structured not the way that I want it to be structured. And so I will be working on that extensively and be glad to work with you as well on that, as well as with our chiefs and others. Let me just say very quickly, and I know time is short. At some point we may want to have a conversation, perhaps with the BCA and perhaps even with the courts in terms of this, a descriptor of race and ethnicity, so that we're clear about what that is and what the process would be, at the moment in terms of what we're asking officers to check off. But I do want to say very quickly that perception does matter. The social science tells us that perception becomes actual when you act on that perception. And knowing why someone acted is critically important and sets up the opportunity to do what you're doing in your field, which is training as a realtor. And the question then becomes, how do I know? How does your field know that that training you've received has been effective? It may be a simple measurement, but there should be a measurement. I guess that's all I'm saying. And I'm less interested, quite frankly, and I think the chief made an important point. We've talked about this in the prior committee as well. I'm not interested in having an attribution that is part of that citation. I think all the issues you raise about what that can cause, I absolutely get. And so I'm glad you're picking on this, because it should be picked on in terms of this language. I think there's a better construct, which really is about how do we capture perception, because perception does matter. That should be part of the database that allows us to make decisions around training, around measuring effectiveness, but should have nothing to do with the actual citation itself.
Chair, actually, just really quick to that. Do we collect this? Is this data collected in Minneapolis?
Madam Chair and members, my understanding is that both Minneapolis and St. Paul do collect this data.
Chief, do you know?
I do not know specifically which agencies are collecting. I do believe Minneapolis is, but I don't know that for a fact.
Very well. And then Representative Lucero, I'm coming to you. I just want to make sure members are cognizant of the time. We're going to stop at exactly 2:40. So Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a quick follow-up then. I think that some of the words that Chair Mariani just referenced was, it is important to determine decisions on why a person has acted. if that's the intent, this doesn't capture that. Because a law enforcement professional can make a decision to stop someone, to pull them over, whatever it is. They've made a decision to act. What this simply does is attempt to have the officer perceive what their, in this case, ethnicity is, perceive what their ethnicity is, but that has nothing to do with how the decision behind why they acted. If that's what the intent is, it assumes now that the officer acted based on ethnicity. And that, to me, it just uncovers another huge problem here in that that is not the assumption that we should be having, that law enforcement professionals are acting based on ethnicity. Because there are many scenarios when an officer can act, let's say a nighttime stop. They don't know what the ethnicity is. They've taken the action to act based on expired tabs, whatever. And then after the fact, now they found out that whatever the fact is, somebody's ethnicity might be, as the officer perceives, again, and then, yeah, so just more concerns that I have, so thank you.
Madam Chair, you know, I don't know how much time we'll have in session on this, but, you know, the studies are pretty thick and rich on the role of implicit bias in all sorts of sectors of our society, especially in public safety.
Thank you, Chair.
And we probably, you know, need to do a deeper dive about those. You know, we heard from our public safety commissioner that implicit bias does in fact matter.
Very good. Representative Johnson.
Madam Chair, Representative Mariani, members, I have quite a few questions that haven't been asked already. But I also want to, since a lot of this stuff, the reporting part, it's the chiefs and the sheriffs, they've talked about it, but it's the guys on the ground, boots on the ground that are going to be affected by this. And I want, see Dennis Flaherty from MPPOA is here. I would like to, I want to actually get his opinion of that, of this bill and how it affects the guys on the ground.
Mr. Flaherty, can you join the testifier table? Thank you, Mr.
Madam
Flaherty.
Chair, members, for the record, Dennis Flaherty with the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. It's a rank and file organization that represents about 9,000 cops working at all levels of government for the state. Did you have some specific questions or?
Representative Johnson.
Chair, Mr. Flaherty, I'd like to know what MPPOA's stance is on this bill.
Mr. Flaherty.
Madam Chair, Representative Johnson, I actually spent a fair amount of time yesterday morning with Representative Mariani discussing some of the specifics of the bill, many of which have been discussed by my colleagues with the chiefs and the sheriffs, because I think it's fair to say we feel basically we have the same concerns. I might have a little additional heartburn with the database of names being forwarded to the post board or wherever they're going to go. And that does cause us some concerns. If it were statistical information only, we wouldn't care as much about that. Particularly since this information is already available in two different manners. One, through any police agency in the state, has to release this information upon request as to discipline that has been given to any of their officers. They have to provide a summary disposition. And secondly, it's already kept at the post board. And it is forwarded to the post board, I believe, annually by chiefs and sheriffs. So this seems like kind of unuseful to me anyhow, but I think our biggest concern is the names. Representative Mariani, I think, is maybe most willing to at least consider statistical information. And then, of course, we do have some concerns about the Peace Officer Training Fund, which we have worked on for decades. It's really special, as you know, Representative Johnson, to every law enforcement agency in the state. And moving that to the general fund and subjecting that to budget pressures of governors and policymakers is very concerning to us. It's for many departments, the main, in fact, the single source of training dollars that they have to provide training for their officers. And so we have worked very hard to get it to the point where it is, and we really want to maintain that. So we would not like that subject to budget cuts and so forth. I mean, I know, I want to believe that everybody in this room truly believes that we need to have the best trained police officers anywhere. And I think that's consistent with the Minnesota model of policing. It's consistent with the creation of the post board when this body created it back in 1978. And it was designed to provide uniform training statewide, so all officers would be trained, have the same type of training, whether you worked in Marshall, Minnesota, or you worked the streets of downtown Minneapolis. And we have established some pretty high training and our standards and training, both. And so we're concerned about that. And I think that just in summary does concern us. But I left Representative Mariani's office with an understanding that he's willing to continue to listen, continue to work with those of us in the law enforcement community, and that's important to us.
Thank you, Mr. Flaherty. And Representative Johnson, so we are going to go to 2:45 actually, so we have 15 more minutes, and there's 4 other people that have questions, so go ahead.
I understand that, Madam Chair. But I say I have a lot of concerns on this bill, such as line 2.13, the nature of the complaint. That which doesn't sound like much, but I think if you talk to law enforcement, whether it's MPPOA, the sheriffs, or the police chiefs, you'll find out that 95% of the complaints are false or inaccurate that come from the public. A lot of times they come in, I know I've talked to my law enforcement people in my community, in my district, and when the person comes in to complain about a situation that happened the day or two before, the sheriff or the police chief will bring them down, show up that video of what happened, and 95% of the time they realize there wasn't anything wrong. But with this, because they came in and complained, that's going to be brought forward. It's a false complaint. It's going to be skew the data.
Chair Mariani.
Madam Chair, it's a good question, and I would then direct the members to the next page on line 3.5 through 3.10, where we define the complaint. And so the complaint then is defined as, one of any of these 5, public reported misconduct, excessive force, the integrity or truthfulness of an officer, violations of law, and or sexual misconduct or harassment. So the idea here is, in fact, not to go hunting around for every single, subjective beef that anyone might have with a Minnesota peace officer, but really to hold ourselves to this high standard of expectation in terms of the standards of our peace officers. Certainly willing to continue to work, on that, but I think we've done a pretty good job of really putting some strong bumpers around those really, in many instances, I would say, unarguable expectations that we would have of our peace officers.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, you just described 100% of every complaint against a peace officer. Whether they're true or not, you described 100% of every complaint. where you say that's the only ones and try to limit it. Now, law enforcement has done a good job with their training and trying to get things done on a as quick as they can. NAMI was up here talking about mental health issues. It took law enforcement 15 years to get the training they needed, and even getting it started for mental health issues. In 1987, we were trying to get mental health issue training. And I don't think it started till about 2007. Law enforcement knows the training they need. They go out and find it. They see what's going on, see what's happening. They are well ahead of the game. By the time we get this data, things are going to change. As far as tying the funding to the NIBIS, or whatever the acronym is pronounced, I wonder if the representative from the Sheriff Hutton could come up to answer a question for me. While he's coming up, I'll ask the questions. Currently, they're doing the UCR and they're slowly switching over to NIBIS. I'm just wondering if there's any consequences at the federal level right now if a department doesn't do the reporting required under the federal law.
Sheriff Hutton.
Madam Chair, if I understand the question, Representative Johnson, so if they're currently not giving the information to the feds or through the BCA to the feds that is required, could there be consequences?
That is correct.
I believe so.
So,
Representative Johnson, we have 4 other, can we come back to you? I just want to, the other questions might be a little bit quicker, so I'm going to come back to you. One moment. Sheriff, if you just want to stay up there. Representative Dean, then we have Poston, Moeller, and Pinto, and then we'll go back to Representative Johnson. So Representative Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to be brief. This is a question that I've had for quite some time, and I know it probably varies, and maybe the Sheriff can talk. What proportion of this training money is actually coming out of this money, and what is sort of the obligation of the local law enforcement unit? Because I know that, law enforcement units have training money as well. And how are most departments sort of looking at this money as supplement to their training and not as replacement to that training? If you could speak to, and I'm sure different departments do it differently, because some probably have larger budgets for training than other departments do. If you could just talk like in 45 seconds, sort of explain as best you can.
Sheriff Hutton.
Madam Chair, I once too was an elected official, so 45 seconds doesn't make it. Gosh, I get what Representative Dean, what I can say to that is I get emails, phone calls, if not daily, every other day, from sheriff's offices throughout the state of Minnesota asking for direction as to where they can get the training. They want more training in the categories that have already been described. So it is regularly occurring and regularly being asked for. So yes, there is the appetite. Matter of fact, the MSA is in the process of our relationship with Minnesota CIT to develop more and more training for our membership.
Representative Dean.
And Madam Chair, just briefly, so as far as what is sort of the local portion versus, the funding that we put in place a few years ago, how is that sort of handled, or is the expectation in these 3 areas, whether it's de-escalation, mental illness, or implicit bias, is the expectation that 100% of that is paid for by the state dollars that we put forward?
Sheriff Hutton.
And Chair, Representative Dean, no, and this is where I might have to call a friend, meaning Post, I believe. At the request, the information that the Post gathers annually, there's $35 million in training that is reported to Post. And obviously, that's not the dollar amount. And if I speak poorly or wrongly on that, Executive Gove?
I can just, if we could get those numbers in the future at some point just to look at, that would be great.
Thank you. Director Go, I think heard you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Moeller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple comments here, and I'm a little frustrated that my colleagues are gone. I understand we're over and they were gone, but some of the themes that I'm hearing that have been repeated from both this hearing and what we heard earlier in judiciary, it seems to me to be this false sense of we can't appreciate the jobs that police do to protect us in the line of duty while also recognizing that implicit bias exists. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Those things are both things that I believe in. And as a prosecutor, I see law enforcement risking their lives on a daily basis to protect us, and I appreciate that work. Also, as a prosecutor, I'm aware of implicit bias that exists among all of us, not just to police. To me as a prosecutor, and I spoke about this morning, I had implicit bias training. And it was life-changing to me. And I'll tell you another thing that was life-changing to me was when I heard that Philando Castile had been stopped, I think, over 40 or 50 times for traffic violations. Those things, that was a life-changing thing for me to hear that too, and really to try to recognize the existence of implicit bias. So I just want to be clear that I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. Also, you know, yes, we are trained not to look at race, but implicit bias exists. And so how can we best address that? Through training, through collecting data to understand if our training is working or to understand how we can make more improvements on that. There was also a question about, well, what's the community doing around this area and how can we make the community change? But we have a system that disproportionately impacts people of color. And part of this committee's job, it's the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee, and we're looking at all of those things. So I just wanted to make those few points. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Moeller. Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and that's actually a really nice transition. I just want to build on that and note, so there's actually a test that we can each take. It's called the Implicit Association Test. It's online. That will show each of us to the extent to which we are or not seeing color, and I think for almost all of us, we are. I took it myself. The first time I took it, I just didn't believe it, and then I had to take it a second time and then realized that no, in fact, it is kicking in. That has nothing to do with the kind of occupation we have. Unfortunately, Representative Lucero is no longer here, but I have to say that the officers that I work with, on average, I think are more dedicated, dedicated public service. I think at least as dedicated to acting in a fair way, et cetera, as anybody else that I interact with, as I say, if not more. And they're also human beings, just like all of us. And the idea that the human beings simply don't see color, don't see race and ethnicity, unfortunately, just tests have shown that in general is not true. And again, we can each one of us figure it out for ourselves by just taking the test online. And so we can discuss the details of the bill, but that idea of not seeing color and being trained that way, I think it's been shown to not be true, for better or worse. Thank you.
All right, we have 5 minutes left. Representative Johnson, we're back to you. Do you have questions still?
Madam Chair, I'm concerned about this study. We've done study after study after study, but we've never acted on them. It's $200,000 that could actually go towards training more officers. You heard the number. We have over $35 million is spent in the state on law enforcement training, yet we only reimburse about $6 million. We have very well-trained officers. Do we have a bad apple here and there? It's in every profession, and we do our best to weed them out. I think we've done enough studies. Law enforcement knows what they need to do. We need to look at some of the other issues that are causing the issues in law enforcement. Some of the issues that I've seen is in the press. We've had a number of incidences where the press have condemned the police officers. Once the investigation done or court is done, the officer was right. The officer had a lot to deal with, that it destroyed their lives, but the officer had done the right thing. Yet the press and the public and the protests had destroyed that officer. We do have one incident where the officer did the wrong thing, and he's getting charged out, as he should. but he's still innocent until proven guilty in court. And hopefully that court date will be here soon. We've had the press just going after law enforcement. Law enforcement is doing the best they can to protect everybody. In order for law enforcement to stop somebody, give them a citation, they have to have probable cause. And if they don't have probable cause, it's an illegal stop. And if a prosecutor is going on with the citation or the charges, and it was done without probable cause, maybe we need to look just as close as the prosecutors as we're going after law enforcement. So I'm going to end it with there. I think it's time for us to act instead of study. And so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Chair Mariani, would you have any closing comments? Members have to be to caucus. It sounds like a
Chair,
2:45.
very quickly, just 4 quick points. One, this is not a study. This is a process. This is how we protect the investment that we are currently making in training. If there were no problems, why did we decide to make $12 billion biennial additional investment under Chair Cornish several years ago? So let's deal straight up with what the realities are on the ground. I think Representative Mulder said it right. There's no put down of any sector, including our law enforcement, by lifting up the need to be better at what we do. I think there's bipartisan support for that. Perception matters, members. You know, there was a Sikh place of worship that was attacked a few years ago. You know, many people were killed. And they were attacked because the attacker thought that was a place of Muslims gathering. Well, that in and of itself is evil and wrong, except Sikhs aren't Muslims. Perception matters. Members, this bill actually extends the funding. There's no proposal here to do harm to the investment that we've made. My bill actually says we should keep funding our police officers, our training in police officers. That's how we should be approaching what is in this bill. And then my final point, members, is that I am absolutely committed. I already got a lot of things that I've heard from all sorts of folks here that's going to substantially change this when it comes back before you. I'm committed to continuing to do that. This is not about ego or getting, a superior position of one group over the other. Not at all. This is about doing what we're supposed to be doing here, which is continuing to expect high-quality public service out of our government, including law enforcement, making the proper investments in doing that, and having the right information so that we know we're doing it the best to our ability. And that's going to take all of us, weighing in about how we can do this better. And so I am absolutely committed to that and look forward to continuing to interact with all of you in that regard.
Well, with that, thank you, members. We will be adjourned. I want to thank everybody for having respectful dialogue today. Meeting adjourned.